Good afternoon, everyone. It's very kind of so many of you to give up your lunch times to come along to this. But it is the anniversary of the battle, and we're on the day of the battle, the centenary of the battle, so I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. As Stephen says, here's my title, Evolution of Divisional Command in 1917. And I'm going to speak for just over 40 minutes, if you can bear it. And then if anyone's got any questions, I'm very happy to try and pick those up at the end. I wonder why that isn't working. What's that one? Sorry, wrong. Okay. Excellent. 100 years ago, at this very moment, at 12:35 on the 7th of June 1917, Oliver Nugent, commander of the Ulster Division, was writing a letter to his wife Kitty from his headquarters opposite Messines Ridge. And there's a picture of them taken just after the war. In it, he updated her on the progress of the battle, which had begun at 3:10 that morning. The fact that he had time to write a letter at all says something about divisional command at this stage of the war, and we'll come back to that shortly. In his letter, Nugent described the progress of the division's attack on the ridge, and I quote, "Up to now, thank God, all seems to have gone well. We have captured White Sheet side by side with the 16th Irish Division. The Anzacs on our right have got Messines, and the 36th Division have got all the ridge between the two places. For over 2.5 years, the Germans have looked down from White Sheet and the ridge in Messines on us at the bottom of the hill. I hope they will never get it back now." End of quote. Messines was, of course, the Ulster Division's most successful battle, and it's also important because of the symbolism of the 16th and 36th Division's joint attack. And Tim Bowman yesterday looked in detail at the extent to which rhetoric and reality aligned there, and I won't attempt to cover the same ground now. What I would like to do, however, is to try to put Messines into the context of Nugent's evolving roles as a divisional commander in 1917. 1917 tends to be seen as a year of stagnation. The disappointment of Arras in April, in which the Ulster Division wasn't involved, was followed by the grim attrition of Passchendaele and the unfulfilled promise of Cambrai, with Messines standing out as the only clear-cut success. But in reality, the stagnation was geographic, not operational or intellectual, and a lot was going on under the surface. Each of these battles presented Nugent with different command challenges. Messines, famously, was a highly successful example of the fight and hold approach, where good generalship and favourable terrain, but also importantly, German mistakes, led to a major British success. Langemarck, part of the Third Ypres offensive, was the reverse. A poorly conceived breakthrough operation conducted in dreadful conditions against much improved German defensive tactics. And then there was Cambrai, where the tactics used by both sides were closer conceptually to 1944 than to 1914, and which represented one of Nugent's most complex command challenges of the war. A few years ago, the concept of the British Army's learning curve in the Great War was all the rage, and no one could give a lecture without mentioning it approvingly. Now it's just as fashionable to treat the learning curve with a degree of scorn and make the point that the learning process was uneven. As always, the truth lies somewhere in between. By December 1917, the Ulster Division was undoubtedly technically more proficient than it had been 12 months earlier. But its experience in the intervening 12 months had been up and down. At Messines in June, it was as good as any division in the BEF, and again in November at Cambrai, it was a highly effective formation. But in January 1917, still recovering from the Somme, it was below average in terms of its operational capability, and the same was true in late August after 3rd Ypres. The division, like the rest of the army, was undoubtedly a learning organisation, but its development didn't proceed smoothly along an upward curve. As divisional commander, Nugent had three chief responsibilities: training his division, planning its operations, and commanding it in action. And in considering these 1917 battles, I'd like to look at aspects of all three, starting with the training task facing Nugent at the start of the year. And there was much for Nugent to do, because in early 1917, the Ulster Division was no longer capable of conducting high-intensity operations. It had suffered over 5,000 casualties on the Somme and hadn't been brought up to strength afterwards. Despite this, it had, since August 1916, been continuously in the line, its infantry units constantly between a quarter and a third below strength. The reason, of course, was the recruiting crisis in Ireland. But even when the War Cabinet eventually agreed in October 1916 to send non-Irish drafts to the Irish divisions, the problems weren't immediately solved. There was an initial surge of new recruits in November, and Nugent got a surprise when inspecting one group of conscripts. I gave them an address, he told Kitty, and good advice, and said I hoped they would be very happy and well looked after. And at the end, they called out, "Thank you, sir." I nearly fainted. Such want of discipline on parade too. Besides, the idea of the British soldier thanking one for anything was too much. But the flow of men then dried up again, and by the end of January 1917, the division was struggling. Nugent wrote to GHQ, pointing out that his men were tired out, specialist training was impossible, and the lack of reinforcements was beginning to damage morale. This wasn't, I think, a case of deliberately neglecting the Irish divisions, but of giving priority to those formations that were preparing for the Arras offensive. However, at last in February and March 1917, large-scale drafts did arrive, and in the space of just a few weeks, the division's operational capability was transformed. And it's worth spending just a couple of minutes looking at precisely how this was done, because it's a good example of how the learning process worked in a frontline division at this stage of the war. The British had used the winter of 1916-17 to take stock of their own experiences on the Somme and those of the French at Verdun, develop new tactics and organisations. The lessons were captured in two important pamphlets shown here, SS 135, Instructions for the Training of Infantry Divisions for Offensive Action, published in December 1916. This is the 1918 edition with a slightly different title. And SS 143, Instructions for the Training of Platoons for Offensive Action, published in February 1917. There were in fact two parallel processes underway within British doctrine at this time: the growing decentralisation of infantry tactics and the increasing centralisation of artillery and other specialist support, and both had implications for the way Nugent exercised command. Starting with the infantry then, new infantry tactics were introduced into the BEF in early 1917. And we should note briefly here the important role played by another Irish general, Arthur Solly Flood from Wexford. A descendant of Henry Flood, the 18th century Irish parliamentarian, he was responsible for training in the Third Army and did a great deal, learning from the French, to design the new methods. The tactics were based around a reorganised infantry platoon with 4 mutually supporting sections comprising Lewis gun, bombers, rifle grenadiers and riflemen. The intention was to reintroduce the infantry's capacity for independent fire and manoeuvre to enable them to fight their way forward once their supporting artillery had lifted onto other targets. For the new system to work, however, it needed both enough men to make the platoons viable and sufficient time to train them, especially specialists like Lewis gunners. By late March 1917, following the influx of reinforcements, the Ulster Division at last had both. Nugent knew that the training window was tight. Plumer's Second Army was already preparing for an attack at Messines, and he drove the training process hard. Each of his brigades in turn came out of the line for an intensive course, starting with a lecture and tactical demonstration for the officers. This was then followed by a 12-day training cycle, in which 3 days were spent successively on platoon, company, battalion and brigade practices. In effect, the new tactics were being taught as battle drills, a precursor to the battle school system the Army would use in World War II, and Nugent supervised the process closely. In the case of 107 Brigade, for example, he attended the initial conference with the brigade commanders and the COs, and then spent 3 days watching the brigade's battalions going through the different training phases, and General Plumer himself came to see the final brigade exercise. Learning new tactical drills was one thing, however. Changing mindsets was another. At the training's conclusion, 107 Brigade's war diary made some perceptive comments, and I quote, "In these 12 days, an entirely new system of warfare had to be learned and adopted, viz. The platoon as the unit armed with its own particular weapons. The period available wasn't really long enough to allow for sufficient being taught, but nevertheless, very considerable progress was made. The men were very keen and took considerable interest throughout. The greatest difficulty was the junior officer. It was difficult to make the platoon commander understand that he was in command of his platoon, and his difficulty was considerably increased by his lack of imagination or initiative. At the end of the 12 days, junior officers were just beginning to understand the importance of their position." Unquote. So to address this weakness, the brigade in early May ran a further week-long course for over 30 of its young officers and platoon sergeants with the object, as it put it, of improving their imagination and initiative. The results were judged to be very satisfactory, and Nugent supported their efforts strongly. He also sent a brigadier and 2 staff officers down to Arras to visit one of the Canadian divisions that had captured Vimy Ridge to learn from their experience. The need for a shift in attitude also applied to Nugent himself, however. The new tactics required the delegation of more authority to his subordinates. And this was in sharp contrast to his approach on the 1st of July 1916, when his much resented refusal to allow his COs to accompany their battalions into the attack had epitomised highly centralised divisional control. But the new system also had implications for the training establishment at home. And it's no coincidence that it was now, in the spring of 1917, as the responsibilities of platoon commanders increased, that Nugent had a serious row with Brigadier General Hackett Payne, commanding 15 Reserve Brigade in Ireland, about the poor training of new officers joining the division. Hackett Payne had served with the division until December 1915, when he was posted home as unfit for active service, and one can see why he wasn't back in the enormous background. Amongst the training deficiencies about which Nugent made a formal complaint was 15 Brigade's failure to utilise properly the operational experience of wounded officers attached to it while recuperating. Hackett Payne already disliked Nugent intensely, and this made matters worse. But even so, Nugent was quite right. At the same time that Nugent was delegating authority to his brigadiers and COs, some of his own responsibilities were being drawn up to corps level, the next command tier up. The Somme had demonstrated that in large-scale operations, artillery, engineers and logistic assets were best directed and coordinated at corps level, and by 1917 that trend was accelerating. In February, for example, one of the division's 3 artillery brigades, or regiments, was taken away as part of a general move to concentrate artillery firepower at army and corps level. And increasingly, in major battles, the divisional commanders lost direct control of those specialist assets they still had. In Nugent's case, for example, the divisional artillery effectively ceased to be under his operational command from late May 1917 until early September. When the division was pulled out of the line after Messines, the gunmen stayed on supporting other formations, went straight from there into action at Ypres ahead of the rest of the division, and then once again remained in the line after the Ulster infantry had been withdrawn. The same is true of the equally hard-worked sappers and pioneers. The BEF was becoming a more sophisticated military machine that required increased flexibility from both its structures and its commanders. In the first half of 1917, therefore, there were major doctrinal and organisational changes underway. So let's now look at their application at Messines, 100 years ago today. Plumer's plan to capture the ridge involved 12 divisions, the attack being preceded by the detonation of a series of huge mines under the German positions, which is the battle's most distinctive feature. But almost as impressive was the concentration of nearly 2,300 British guns to support the attack, supplemented by hundreds of trench mortars and over 700 Vickers machine guns. The Ulster Division would attack the centre of the ridge as part of 9 Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Hamilton Gordon, with the 16th Division on its left. And they would advance on either side of the village of Whitesheet, the final objective being about 2,000 yards from the start line. And I will now try and work this pointer thing that dazzling a pilot trying to land the signal. There is the Messines Ridge, we are there. There is 9 Corps attacking in the centre. We have 2 Corps attacking north and southward, and that contains 16th and 36th Division. 16th Division attacking to the north of Whitesheet, 36th Division attacking to the south, with the objective running along the top of the ridge there. The thoroughness of Second Army's preparations impressed participants. Nugent, after the war, described the attack as a perfect example of trained effort in which nothing essential to success had been overlooked. And the crucial feature from Nugent's perspective was that he and his staff were closely involved from the outset, and their suggestions were taken on board. This was a tightly controlled operation based on firepower, and Nugent was very comfortable with it. He and Plumer got on well. Plumer told him in March the 36th was the best division in Second Army, and for him, the Second Army had become the army I shall always swear by, they know how to get things done, and what's far more important, and what's far more important, they know and understand British infantry. Between late May and the 6th of June, the British fired 3.5 million shells onto Messines Ridge, destroying much of the German wire, obliterating long stretches of their trenches, and knocking out much of their artillery. A rather crumpled map to give a 3D effect, but you can see past the foes. By the evening of the 6th of June, the division's assault troops were in position, with 109 Brigade on the left and 107 on the right. Each would attack with 2 battalions in the first wave and 2 in the second, and both had an attached battalion from 108 Brigade to act as moppers up. The division also had a section of 4 tanks, its first experience of working with armour. The plan was for the first wave to take the blue line halfway up the slope. The second wave battalions would then advance to the black line, the division's final objective on top of the ridge. And so British front line is running along here. The blue line is the intermediate objective. The first wave battalions would take, and the black line on top of the ridge is the final objective. They were supported by both a creeping barrage and a standing barrage targeted on particular trenches and strong points. In the early hours of 7th of June, Nugent went to an observation post on Kemmel Hill to watch the start of the attack. At 3:10 a.m., 19 huge mines, 5 of them on the Ulster Division's front, containing almost 1 million pounds of explosive, went up, in Nugent's words, in a lurid, gigantic sheet of flame. And then something like 3,000 guns opened fire along the Second Army front, and the whole country beyond the German front line became a sheet of flame and smoke. It might have been literally the end of the world. Moving forward behind the barrage, the first wave battalions quickly captured the blue line. The advance on the black line encountered patchy resistance, but the new platoon tactics quickly proved their worth, and a staff officer wrote afterwards, "There was no quarter given to the machine gunners. They now have the satisfaction of knowing we've got our own back on the brutes who got us on July the 1st. In a highly symbolic operation, the 9th Inniskillings and the 1st Munster Fusiliers of the 16th Division jointly cleared the ruins of Whitesheet, and by 8:40 a.m, the black line had been taken. To Nugent's surprise, the expected immediate German counterattacks didn't materialise. And the reason they didn't materialise, at least until too late, was that their reserves had been held too far back, a mistake that cost the local German commander, General von Lappert, shown here, his job. Messines wasn't just a major British victory, it was also, self-evidently, a significant German defeat, and one that fits into a pattern of German reverses in 1917 when defending ridge lines. The first had come at Vimy Ridge in April, the Canadians' famous victory. That was followed by Messines in June, and a third major setback occurred at Malmaison in the Chemin des Dames in October, the French army's comeback battle after the meetings of the summer. And this round of defeats wasn't a coincidence. Defending ridges represented a particular challenge at this start stage of the war for the German defensive method. The temptation was naturally to front-load the defence, to hold the high ground. But often that meant crowding men onto narrow linear features where, given the developments in artillery by 1917, they were vulnerable to massive offensive firepower. And that, of course, is what happened at Vimy and at Messines. This was compounded by the difficulty of moving their reserves into position in sometimes difficult terrain and of timing their counterattacks just right, always a very difficult thing to do. If you wanted to lose your job as a German general on the Western Front in 1917, being ordered to defend a ridge was a good place to start. It wasn't, however, just a problem for the Germans. Precisely the same thing would happen to the French and British in the Third Battle of the Aisne in May 1918. But the point here, of course, is that when considering British performance on the Western Front, we have to consider the Germans also. Over 1,200 prisoners had been taken by the Ulster Division, and hundreds of the enemy had been killed. By the time it was relieved on the night of the 9th of June, its total casualties stood at around 1,100, much lighter than expected. The after-action reports were uniformly enthusiastic about the new platoon tactics, and Nugent was delighted by how the battle had gone, describing it as the most successful the British Army has had in this war. On the 7th of June, in fact, he had only one unscheduled decision to take. In mid-morning, Hamilton Gordon decided to strengthen the outpost line to cover the next phase of the British advance, and Nugent had to rush 2 battalions forward to do so. He did make other decisions, of course, but these were ones he had anticipated, indeed almost timetabled, like when to send reinforcements up to help consolidate the new position, which is why he had the time to write to Kitty. In early July, therefore, when the division left Second Army for Hubert Goth's Fifth Army, it did so in high spirits. The 16th Division moved too, and both now came under the command of Lieutenant General Watts's 19 Corps. Their transfer together suggests that the idea of maintaining that partnership was becoming established, and another success like Messines might have led to the creation of a permanent Irish Corps. Tragically, however, their next battle was nothing at all like Messines. In terms of operational planning, the situation at Third Ypres was the reverse of Messines. At Messines, the German commander had been caught between two stools when deciding how to manage his defensive battle, whereas Plumer knew exactly how he wanted to conduct an attack. At Ypres, by contrast, there was confusion between Haig and Gough from the outset about how the British offensive was to be conducted. Haig, it seems, favoured a succession of bite and hold operations. Gough, on the other hand, believed he was to seek a breakthrough, and that this required a series of pushes mounted in rapid succession with stretching tactical objectives and with a focus on urgency rather than thorough preparation. The Germans, by contrast, were in a better place than at Messines. Their defences had just been reorganised by their defensive expert, Colonel, soon-to-be Major General von Lossberg, into a series of zones, each 2,000 to 3,000 yards deep. And these were designed to absorb an attacker's momentum in a forward zone, halt him in a main battle zone, the area being dotted with scores of concrete pillboxes for this purpose, and then defeat him by counterattacks. And as an aside, over the next year or so, we should learn a great deal more about German tactics in 1917. David Zabecki, retired American general a few years ago, wrote a very good book on the German offensives in 1918. Is producing a new edition of von Lossberg's memoirs, which will come out soon. An historian called Tony Cowan, working in London, has what promises to be an excellent book coming out, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of German mission control in 1917. And Jonathan Boff from Birmingham University has a biography of von Ruprecht, Crown Prince von Ruprecht, coming out early next year. And on the other side of the fence, I should also mention our own Tim Bowman, who's co-authored a book on the British Army and the Great War. Should appear any day now if the publishers get their act together. And of course, Tom's thesis on morale in the Army, which I hope is going to be a book sometime.
It will be, yes.
So there's lots of good work using those covered to take another gulp of water. Sorry. So there's plenty of good work going on. Right. Returning to the battle then, the Fifth Army's opening attack on the 31st of July did make some progress, albeit with significant losses. Even so, it fell well short of the ambitious objectives Gough had set. Watts of 19 Corps had kept the two Irish divisions in reserve and led off with his other two divisions, the 55th and 15th. And the 19th, you won't be able to read it, I suspect, there is Ypres, 19 Corps sector is here, 55th and 15th divisions are there. The Ulster divisions of the attack sector will be slightly up here when we get to that point. The 15th and 55th initially did quite well before being hit by powerful counterattacks and forced back with heavy casualties, while Lossberg's defensive system working as intended. To add to the difficulties that night, torrential rain began teeming down. The ground deteriorated frighteningly quickly. This picture, one of the iconic images of Passchendaele, was actually taken on the 1st of August, after less than 24 hours of rain, in a sector just north of the Ulster divisions. And it was in these conditions that the Ulster division relieved the 55th. For the next fortnight, like the 16th division beside them, Nugent's troops held the line in horrendous conditions of rain, mud, and murderous shell fire. Nugent did what he could to protect his men, manning the front line as lightly as possible and rotating his units. But by the 15th of August, the division had suffered over 1,500 casualties and was exhausted. The 16th Division was in the same condition. Despite this, Gough didn't relieve either of them before his next big push at dawn on the 16th of August, known as the Battle of Magma. The Third Battle of Ypres was an unusual experience operationally for the Ulster Division, in that it was the only occasion during Nugent's time in command that it was inserted into an offensive battle already underway. On the Somme, at Messines, and at Cambrai, it formed part of the opening assault, preceded in each case by weeks of careful preparation. So the planning here was by definition a less clear-cut process, compounded by the fact that because of the conditions, Nugent couldn't get right up to the front line to see things for himself. In outline, however, his attack plan for Langemarck was like the one he used at Messines. The division would again attack with 2 brigades, 109 on the left, 108 on the right, but each attacking this time with 3 battalions rather than 4. The division's final objective was the red line, about 2,000 yards from their start line, with an intermediate one, the green line, about half that distance. So the British front line going along here, green line is the intermediate objective, the red line, the final objective up there. In the end, hardly anything got as far as the green line. The supporting artillery programme, with a combination of creeping and standing barrages, was again similar to Messines. But the underlying operational realities, including the fighting power the division could deploy, were quite different. Nugent was attacking with six battalions rather than 10, none at more than 2/3 strength. His infantry was therefore less than half as strong as it would seem. There were no huge mines this time to obliterate the German forward defences, and these were formidable, the ground between the start line and the green line being covered by a network of powerful, unsuppressed pillboxes. In this sector here, some of them are named on that map. The objectives were too deep for the conditions, the artillery was too weak to suppress the defences, and the men were too few and too exhausted for the task they'd been given. This was the Western Front at its worst, and the contrast between Plumer's empathetic leadership and Gough's cavalier approach couldn't have been clearer. At 4:45 a.m. on the 16th of August, the leading waves left their trenches and were raked by machine guns almost immediately, the barrage soon outdistancing the struggling infantry. Small gains were made on the right and the far left, but everywhere the attackers were soon pinned down in the crossfire from the pillboxes. At around 6 a.m., the Ulster Division attack collapsed. A reserve battalion moving up met men from the assaulting battalions streaming to the rear. 3 of the COs of the 4 lead battalions, the 4th was already dead, rushed forward to try to stem the retreat, one being killed and another seriously wounded. Their intervention temporarily stabilized the line, but at 9 a.m., a devastating counterattack by the reinforced 5th Bavarian Division struck the 2 Irish formations and sent them reeling back to their start line. In contrast to Messines, the German defensive tactics here had worked perfectly. Gough ordered a further attack that afternoon, but Nugent and Hickey, commander of the 16th, objected strongly, pointing out that their shattered units couldn't be ready. Gough then insisted the attack be resumed the next day, and Nugent wrote to Kitty that night, "It has been a truly terrible day, worse than the 1st of July, I'm afraid. Our losses have been very heavy indeed, and we have failed all along the line. Tomorrow we have to make another attack at dawn, and I have no men to do it with. It is a ghastly business." At Messines, Nugent had to make hardly any decisions because everything had gone right. At Langemarck, he had hardly any to make because nothing had gone right. Now his most pressing task was to try to overturn someone else's decision, and between them, fortunately, Nugent and Hickey were able to convince Watts that a further attack was impossible. The recriminations started at once. Gough told Haig the next day that he wasn't pleased with the Irish divisions. They seemed to have gone forward, but failed to keep what they had won, Haig noted in his diary. The men are Irish and apparently didn't like the enemy shelling, so Gough said. Haig heard a similar story from Watts. And Gough's comments in particular, made about exhausted men committed to a virtually hopeless attack, go far to explain the Fifth Army's negative reputation. The 2 Irish divisions, who didn't like the enemy shelling, had lost between them over 4,000 men on the 16th of August and nearly 8,000 in total since going into the line. Nugent, who never forgave Gough, not only lost over 2,000 men during the attack itself, but also 5 of his 12 commanding officers in the month of August, a serious loss. And what the summer of 1917 demonstrated was that for operational improvement to be continuous, the learning needed to happen simultaneously at different levels of command. The disaster at Langemarck came not because the division had become de-skilled, but because Gough was less skilled at mounting Western Front operations than Plumer. At the end of August, the Ulster Division left Fifth Army without regret to join 4 Corps in Byng's Third Army. The 16th Division went to Third Army also, but to a different corps. Langemarck had brought to an end the experiment of operating the two Irish divisions together. The decision wasn't taken, I think, because of animosity between the two formations, though there were certainly tensions after Langemarck, but because of their fragility. Their manpower problems meant that both now required significant reorganisation, and putting them in the same corps would have been operationally too risky. Nugent once again had to rebuild his division, and with difficulty he did so, though there isn't time to go into the detail of that now. But that brings us on to our final battle. Cambrai saw the emergence of a genuinely modern operational technique. The use for the first time in combination of massed armour, predicted artillery fire and tactical air power would have been immediately recognisable to a Second World War commander. And Nugent had no difficulty in adjusting mentally to this new operational world, his roots as a Victorian soldier notwithstanding. His problem here, as on other battlefields, would be the failure of tactical communications to match progress in other aspects of military technology. At Cambrai, the division would be in action continuously for 7 days during the British attack and a further 10 days during the German counterstroke. The duration alone imposed demands on Nugent as a commander that he hadn't faced previously. As there isn't time to go through this rather complicated battle in detail, I want to look at just two particular aspects: the planning task facing Nugent in the run-up to the offensive, and how he exercised command during the first 4 days, and in particular, days 3 and 4, the 22nd and 23rd of November. The Third Army's offensive began on the 20th of November and involved 6 infantry and 5 cavalry divisions, 324 fighting tanks, as well as some support variants, and over 1,000 guns, with the limited aim initially of encircling the German forces east of Cambrai. A complicated map, which I'll try and explain in a second. In this opening phase, Nugent had been given 2 separate tasks. The first was to protect the left flank of the British advance. 4 Corps' main attack was being made by 2 divisions, the 62nd and 51st, east of the Canal du Nord, which, though it contained no water, was a significant obstacle. So, you can see that's the Canal du Nord running along there. And this is the German frontline trench. The British are attacking in this direction. The 62nd Division is attacking on the east bank of the canal up towards Borlon, and the 51st is attacking beside it up towards Fontaine. And one of Nugent's tasks is to break in on the west bank, break into the German frontline positions here at the spoil bank with 1 brigade, 109 Brigade, and to advance along it northwards towards the village and move, keeping pace with the 62nd Division on the other bank. So this provide flank protection. And that is quite technically quite a tricky operation. But his second task, using his other 2 brigades, was to provide the Corps Reserve, for which there were several possible uses. And in fact, in the run-up to the battle, Nugent and his small staff were actually working on 5 separate plans. The one for 109 Brigade's break-in on the west bank, another for an advance on the other side of the canal, following up 62nd Division to seize the crossings opposite Inchy. So it's following up the side of the canal to seize the crossings up here. And then 3 alternative plans for either a continuing advance north to cut off the Germans west of the canal, or for attacks northeast towards Borlon if it still hadn't been captured. So once they get to this point, they can either continue north, the battle's going on, to cut off the Germans on this side, or if the attacker really is they wanted to swing northeast and attack towards the Borlon. So the planning task at Cambrai was quite different to that, say, at Messines. And that brings us on to the attack itself. On the opening day, the 20th of November, part of the plan worked brilliantly. 109 Brigade's break-in went like clockwork, and by evening it had advanced 4,000 yards along the Hindenburg line and taken 500 prisoners. On the other side of the canal, however, because 62nd and 51st Divisions didn't make the hoped for progress, neither of Nugent's other brigades could get forward. The next day, 21st of November, was worse. West of the canal, 109 Brigade tried but failed to fight their way into the village of Mouve, and on the east bank, the 62nd and 51st Divisions were again halted by stiffening German resistance, and for the second day running, 107 and 108 Brigades waited for orders to advance, but never came. And it was now on the evening of the second day, the 21st of November, that Nugent was at last given back full control of all 3 of his brigades and ordered to resume the attack northwards next day. In preparation for doing so, he pulled 109 Brigade out for a rest and shifted 108 Brigade over the canal to take their place. So 109 Brigade had been in action continuously for over 48 hours, attacking move. He pulled them out, took 108 Brigade from this side of the canal and moved them up level to 107 Brigades. His two brigades are level on either side of the canal. And the way the orders process operated over the next 48 hours illustrates the challenges facing him in trying to exercise command in the semi-fluid circumstances the division now faced. That night, at 10 p.m. on the 21st of November, he very efficiently issued telephone orders to his brigadiers, a cross between a warning order and the kind of brief radio orders that would be familiar in the next war, instructing them to attack next morning at 11 a.m., 107 Brigade east of the canal, 108 Brigade to the west. 107 Brigade attacking up here, and 108 Brigade attacking from the move. The confirmatory written orders, which contained important details like artillery timings, were in their turn issued just before midnight. But the written orders still had to go forward by dispatch rider and runner in the dark and along congested trenches, and they didn't reach Brigadier General Withycombe in 107 Brigade until 4:30 a.m. on the 22nd of November, the morning of the attack. Withycombe had, however, in anticipation, already assembled his COs at his headquarters, and he was able to hold his own orders group straight away. As HR wasn't until 11 a.m., his battalions then had time to go through their own battle preparations. The cascade of orders, therefore, had worked well. What didn't work well was the division's actual attack. The Germans were reinforcing heavily, and 107 Brigade could get forward only a short distance in the face of intense machine gun fire. On the left, although 108 Brigade successfully captured most of the move, they were soon forced out again by German counterattacks. Nugent was ordered to attack again the next day. This time, however, 107 Brigade on the right would have 11 tanks attached to it. That night, a similar orders process took place. Again, Nugent issued orders by telephone at 11 p.m. for an attack to take place at 10:30 the following morning. Again, Withycombe convened his O group in the early hours, 4 a.m. The problem, however, was that while his infantry COs were there, the tank commanders who would support his attack were not. They were still with their vehicles crawling painfully forward towards the start line. They couldn't be assembled until 8:30 a.m., just 2 hours before the start of the attack, and only then would Withycombe start giving his final orders. HR couldn't be postponed because it was tied with other operations, and there was, therefore, a desperate scramble to get orders out to the battalions. One company commander had only 15 minutes to assemble his men and brief his officers before moving out, and there was no time at all for the tank crews and infantry to marry up properly. Trying to put together on the hoof what was in effect an all-arms divisional attack in semi-fluid tactical conditions, while relying on a single telephone line to brigade and with no electronically enabled voice communications forward of that, where the artillery, of course, had their own net, was hugely difficult. And not surprisingly, therefore, the attack on the 23rd of November went badly. A tank did help 107 Brigade capture a position called Round Trench, but the other 10 either broke down or were quickly knocked out, and the attack was soon halted. On the right here is a picture of 3 of the tanks actually used in the attack, who were taken out by German guns. Because they all came from the Tank Corps E Battalion, they all had names beginning with E, and these are, from left to right, Eileen, Eclipse, and Eve. And 2 of their commanders left accounts of the day's fighting, now in the archives at King's College, London. On the west bank, 108 Brigade, for the second day running, fought its way into move, only to be forced out again, the German defences now increased. I won't go on to the succeeding days, other than to note that command and control would get steadily harder as the fighting became more fragmented and people, generals as well as frontline soldiers, became more exhausted. I am tired and no mistake, Nugent wrote on the 24th of November. And the next day he noted, I am more anxious about the men than anything else. They are absolutely worn out. It is really dreadful going around to see the white drawn faces and red eyes of overtired men. I would, though, like to touch briefly on where Nugent positioned himself during the fighting. His headquarters was in the village of Ypres, about 5 miles behind the front. That was where his communications were, with corps, with the guns, with flanking formations. But throughout the battle, he was frustrated by the slowness with which information came in, and wherever possible, he went forward in person to try to find out what was going on. He spent the first day of the battle, 20th of November, at his HQ. On the 21st, during the day, he went forward to see his brigadiers. On the 22nd, he remained at his HQ again, where Douglas Haig called in to see him. That was the day Haig controversially decided to keep the offensive going, a decision Nugent disagreed with. But Haig also noted in his diary that he didn't think the divisional commanders were getting out enough to see the situation for themselves. That certainly wasn't true of Nugent. He was out once more on the 23rd, watching 108 Brigade's attack on the move, and out again visiting the front on the 24th. Here was a general who didn't believe in remaining in his shadow. And this gave rise to Cyril Falls's interesting observations written in the 1960s about British First World War generals. Falls, of course, was on Nugent's staff from 1916 until early 1918, and thereafter was a liaison officer with the French. He wrote, "In general, British commanders and staffs went forward much more than the French, and indeed too often during the battle. It was absurd that the divisional commander and the GSO-1 should be absent at the same time on such occasions, but this was too often the case. At Cambrai, at one stage of the battle, I was the only representative of the general staff in the office, and the divisional commander was out." Clearly then, Falls thought Nugent went forward too much at Cambrai. To conclude then, precisely a century ago today, Nugent was still writing his letter home as the scale of the division's success at Messines started to sink in. Plumer's good planning and his own strong leadership had paid dividends. He must have hoped that these high standards were the new normal, but the shambles of Langemarck soon disabused him of that. Had we been at Nugent's headquarters on the 16th of August, in the aftermath of a shattering defeat, and just a couple of hours after he reluctantly agreed to bring the British barrage back to the start line, knowing that it would kill some of his own men still out in no man's land, the mood would have been utterly different. Cambrai represented the future, with new opportunities and challenges. Had we visited Nugent's HQ around this time on, say, the 23rd of November, he wouldn't have been there. He'd have been on his way forward to try to see for himself what was going on in a more fluid and more modern battle than anything he'd yet experienced. His instinct from our 21st century perspective feels right, but while he was on the move, he was unable to exercise full command of his division. And that was the fundamental problem that wouldn't be fully solved until the next war. But the massive difference, tactically and technologically, between Cambrai and the Thiepval attack on the 1st of July 1916 is the measure of the scale of the development of warfare in just 17 months, and the scale also of Nugent's own evolution as a divisional commander and his divisions as a fighting entity in the course of 1917. Thank you very much.